The District of Columbia National Guard was activated at 6:15 a.m. this morning under orders from the Secretary of Defense, with approximately 2,500 personnel deploying to establish an expanded security perimeter around federal buildings in downtown Washington. The activation order, which was issued following an emergency National Security Council meeting that concluded at 4:47 a.m., authorizes Guard units to provide security support to federal law enforcement agencies, to establish vehicle checkpoints at key intersections, and to assist with crowd control measures if large-scale demonstrations materialize in response to recent legal and political developments. This is not a routine security enhancement for a planned event or a precautionary measure based on generalized threat assessments. This represents the largest domestic deployment of National Guard forces in the nation's capital since the January 6th attack on the Capitol, and it reflects assessments by intelligence and law enforcement officials that the convergence of criminal indictments, congressional investigations, and pending court deadlines has created conditions where civil unrest or security incidents are sufficiently likely to warrant extraordinary protective measures. The activation order became public when the D.C. Mayor's office released a statement at 7:33 a.m. confirming that federal authorities had notified city officials overnight that National Guard deployment would commence at dawn. According to the mayor's statement, the decision to activate Guard forces was made by federal authorities without consultation with city government, a procedural dynamic that reflects the unique federal jurisdiction over the District of Columbia and the authority of the Secretary of Defense to activate D.C. National Guard units without requesting permission from state governors, as would be required in the 50 states. The mayor's statement expressed concern about the lack of coordination with city officials and requested immediate briefings on the scope, duration, and rules of engagement for the Guard deployment. The scope of the security perimeter being established extends significantly beyond the immediate Capitol complex and White House grounds. According to information provided to congressional leadership during classified briefings conducted throughout the morning, the enhanced security zone encompasses approximately 16 square blocks in downtown Washington, including the Supreme Court, the Department of Justice headquarters, federal courthouse facilities, and congressional office buildings. National Guard personnel are establishing vehicle checkpoints at 12 locations along the perimeter, screening vehicles for weapons or explosives before allowing entry into the secure zone. Additional Guard units are positioned at federal buildings to supplement existing security personnel and to provide rapid response capability if demonstrations or security incidents occur. The justification for this extraordinary security deployment centers on intelligence assessments regarding potential threats that have emerged following the unsealing of the expanded federal indictment and the announcement of the bipartisan congressional task force. According to sources familiar with classified threat briefings provided to the National Security Council, federal law enforcement and intelligence agencies have detected increased online activity by extremist groups discussing potential responses to what they characterize as political persecution of their allies. This online activity allegedly includes specific discussions of targeting federal buildings, of organizing mass demonstrations designed to shut down government operations, and of attempting to intimidate witnesses and jurors involved in pending criminal proceedings. While intelligence officials have stated that they have not identified specific credible plots requiring immediate law enforcement intervention, the volume and intensity of threatening communications has increased to levels that warrant enhanced protective measures. The legal authority for deploying National Guard forces within the District of Columbia derives from federal statutes that treat the D.C. Guard differently from state National Guard units. Under normal circumstances, state governors control their respective National Guard forces and must request federal activation if Guard units are to be deployed for federal purposes or outside state boundaries. However, the President serves as Commander-in-Chief of the D.C. National Guard, and operational control is delegated to the Secretary of Defense. This means that D.C. Guard forces can be activated for federal missions without the involvement or consent of any state official, an arrangement that reflects the constitutional status of the District of Columbia as the seat of the federal government rather than as a state with sovereignty over its own territory. The specific mission parameters for the activated Guard forces have been outlined in operational orders that were provided to congressional leadership under classified conditions. According to members who were briefed on these orders, Guard personnel are authorized to establish security perimeters, to conduct vehicle and pedestrian screening at checkpoints, to provide protective presence at federal facilities, and to assist federal law enforcement agencies with crowd management if demonstrations occur. The orders explicitly prohibit Guard personnel from conducting arrests or from engaging in law enforcement activities beyond providing support to federal agents who retain primary law enforcement authority. Guard forces will operate under rules of engagement that authorize use of force only in defense of themselves or others against imminent threats of death or serious bodily harm. The political reaction to the National Guard activation has been sharply divided along predictable partisan lines, though with some notable exceptions that reflect the complexity of current circumstances. Democratic congressional leaders have generally supported the deployment, characterizing it as a prudent response to credible security threats and as necessary protection for ongoing judicial and legislative processes. The Senate Majority Leader stated during a press conference that recent events, including threats against federal judges, intimidation of witnesses in criminal proceedings, and online extremist activity directed at government officials, justify enhanced security measures to ensure that constitutional processes can proceed without interference or violence. The Speaker of the House similarly defended the deployment while emphasizing that the decision was made by military and law enforcement professionals based on threat assessments rather than being a political calculation. Republican congressional leaders have offered more varied responses that reflect internal party divisions about how to address the current crisis. The Senate Minority Leader expressed concern about what he characterized as the potential militarization of political disputes and questioned whether the threat assessments justifying Guard deployment were based on objective intelligence analysis or on politicized assumptions about which groups pose security risks. However, he also acknowledged that protecting federal facilities and ensuring that judicial proceedings can occur without disruption or intimidation represents a legitimate governmental interest. The House Minority Leader took a stronger position, arguing that the Guard deployment represents an overreaction designed to create an atmosphere of crisis that will be used to justify further extraordinary measures against political opponents. The immediate operational impact of the National Guard deployment involves significant disruption to normal activity in downtown Washington. The vehicle checkpoints at perimeter access points have created traffic delays as vehicles are screened before being allowed to enter the secure zone. Federal employees who work in buildings within the perimeter are required to show identification and submit to bag searches when entering the area. Members of the public seeking to access federal facilities for business or tourism purposes face similar screening procedures and may experience substantial delays. The D.C. Metro Transit System has adjusted service on several lines to accommodate the security perimeter, with some stations near federal facilities experiencing reduced access or modified entry procedures. The duration of the National Guard deployment has not been specified in public statements from federal officials. The activation order, according to sources familiar with its contents, authorizes the deployment for an initial period of 30 days with provisions for extension if threat conditions warrant continued presence. This 30-day timeframe corresponds roughly to the deadline for the Bipartisan Task Force's interim report and encompasses several critical upcoming events, including arraignment proceedings for defendants in the federal criminal case, expected court rulings on executive privilege disputes, and potential congressional contempt votes against officials who have refused to comply with subpoenas. The implication is that federal authorities assess that security risks will remain elevated at least through these near-term developments. The historical context for National Guard deployments in the nation's capital provides perspective on the significance of the current activation. During the Civil Rights era, federal troops were deployed to protect peaceful demonstrators and to enforce court orders desegregating public facilities. During periods of civil unrest, including riots following the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., federal forces were used to restore order and protect property. Following the September 11th attacks, National Guard forces provided security at airports, government buildings, and critical infrastructure for extended periods. Most recently, over 25,000 Guard personnel were deployed to Washington following the January 6th attack on the Capitol, establishing security perimeters that remained in place for several weeks during the period surrounding the presidential inauguration. What distinguishes the current deployment from these historical precedents involves the specific circumstances that triggered the activation. Previous deployments responded to actual violence that had already occurred or to specific credible threats of imminent attack. The current deployment is preventive in nature, based on intelligence assessments that the political and legal environment has created conditions where security incidents are possible, rather than on evidence of specific planned attacks. This preventive approach reflects lessons learned from January 6th, when requests for National Guard support were delayed while violence was already underway at the Capitol. Federal officials have determined that waiting for violence to occur before deploying protective forces represents an unacceptable risk given the stakes involved in protecting ongoing judicial proceedings and constitutional processes. The constitutional questions raised by deploying military forces for domestic security purposes involve long-standing tensions in American law regarding the appropriate role of armed forces in civilian governance. The Posse Comitatus Act, passed in 1878, generally prohibits using federal military forces to execute civilian laws, reflecting concern about military involvement in domestic political affairs. However, this prohibition contains exceptions, including deployments of National Guard forces operating under state authority and deployments specifically authorized by Congress or by the Constitution itself. The D.C. National Guard operates under federal rather than state authority, and its use for protecting federal facilities and supporting law enforcement is generally understood to fall outside Posse Comitatus restrictions. The practical security considerations driving the deployment involve assessments about the capacity of civilian law enforcement to manage potential threats during a period of heightened tension and multiple convergent deadlines. Federal Protective Services, Capitol Police, D.C., Metropolitan Police, and other law enforcement agencies have finite resources that can be stretched beyond capacity if simultaneous security challenges emerge at multiple locations. National Guard forces provide additional personnel who can establish security perimeters and maintain presence at fixed locations, freeing law enforcement personnel to respond to dynamic situations and to conduct investigations of specific threats. This force multiplication effect is particularly valuable when the duration of elevated threat conditions extends over weeks rather than days. The intelligence assessments that justified the activation, according to briefings provided to congressional leadership, include several categories of concerning activity. First, federal agents monitoring online extremist forums have observed increased discussion of organizing mass demonstrations in Washington with the explicit goal of disrupting government operations and pressuring officials to drop criminal charges and congressional investigations. These discussions have included specific calls to surround federal buildings and to prevent officials from entering or leaving, tactics that would constitute obstruction of governmental functions, and potentially criminal interference with judicial proceedings. Second, federal agencies have detected threats directed at specific individuals, including federal judges handling privilege disputes, prosecutors involved in the criminal case, and members of Congress serving on the bipartisan task force. While many such threats consist of vague, hostile rhetoric that does not rise to the level of actionable criminal conduct, the volume and intensity of threatening communications has increased substantially in recent days. Third, and most concerning, according to sources familiar with the classified briefings, intelligence agencies have identified several individuals with histories of violent extremism who have traveled to the Washington area in recent days without clear legitimate purposes for their presence. Law enforcement is maintaining surveillance on these individuals and has conducted interviews with some of them, but the concentration of multiple persons with violent backgrounds in proximity to federal facilities during a period of political tension has elevated threat assessments. The National Guard deployment provides enhanced security presence that makes it more difficult for individuals with hostile intent to access vulnerable areas or to conduct surveillance that might facilitate planning for attacks. The operational coordination between National Guard forces and civilian law enforcement agencies involves complex command structures designed to ensure that military personnel support rather than supplant civilian authority. Under the deployment orders, Guard forces operate under federal military chain of command, but coordinate closely with federal law enforcement agencies, including the Secret Service, FBI, and Capitol Police. Joint operations centers have been established where military and law enforcement personnel share information about threat assessments and security incidents and coordinate responses to emerging situations. This coordination structure is modeled on approaches used during previous security events and is designed to leverage the complementary capabilities of military and law enforcement organizations while maintaining clear lines of authority and responsibility. The public communication regarding the National Guard deployment has emphasized that the presence of military personnel in the nation's capital should not be interpreted as indicating any change in civilian governmental operations or any suspension of normal constitutional processes. The Secretary of Defense issued a statement emphasizing that Guard forces are deployed solely for protective security purposes and that their presence does not indicate martial law or any restriction on constitutional rights, including freedom of speech, assembly, and petition. The statement explicitly noted that peaceful demonstrations remain protected by the First Amendment and that Guard personnel will not interfere with lawful protests or other exercises of constitutional rights. The international implications of deploying military forces in the American capital during a period of domestic political crisis have not gone unnoticed by foreign governments and international media. Authoritarian regimes that face criticism from the United States regarding human rights and democratic governance have seized on images of military forces establishing checkpoints in Washington as evidence of American hypocrisy and as justification for their own uses of force against domestic opposition. Democratic allies have generally refrained from public comment, but have privately expressed concern through diplomatic channels about the stability of American democratic institutions and about whether the current crisis reflects deeper structural problems in the constitutional system. The impact on ongoing judicial proceedings represents one of the primary justifications for the enhanced security measures. Federal judges handling cases related to executive privilege disputes and criminal prosecutions have received credible threats, according to law enforcement officials, and several judges have requested enhanced security details for themselves and their families. The presence of National Guard forces establishing secure perimeters around courthouse facilities is intended to ensure that judicial proceedings can occur without judges, attorneys, witnesses, or jurors facing intimidation or security risks. This protection of judicial independence is viewed by federal authorities as essential to maintaining the rule of law during a period when political pressures on the justice system are intense. The duration and eventual withdrawal of National Guard forces will depend on evolving threat assessments and on whether the events of coming weeks produce either escalation or de-escalation of tensions. If criminal proceedings advance without major security incidents, if congressional investigations proceed through normal processes, and if political rhetoric and online extremist activity diminish, federal authorities may determine that the enhanced security presence is no longer necessary and may withdraw Guard forces before the initial 30-day authorization expires. Conversely, if security incidents occur, if threats intensify, or if new developments in criminal or congressional proceedings trigger additional political volatility, the deployment could be extended for substantial additional periods. The precedent being established by this deployment will influence how future administrations and federal authorities respond to similar situations involving domestic political conflict and potential security threats. If the preventive deployment of military forces proves effective in deterring violence and protecting governmental functions, it may become a standard response to periods of heightened political tension. If the deployment is perceived as having been unnecessary or as having inflamed rather than calmed tensions, future officials may be more reluctant to authorize similar measures. The evaluation of this deployment's effectiveness and appropriateness will shape security doctrine and practice for years to come. The current situation presents Americans with the unsettling reality of military forces establishing security perimeters in their capital city, not in response to foreign attack or natural disaster, but as a consequence of domestic, political, and legal conflicts. The National Guard personnel deployed are citizen soldiers who in their civilian lives are neighbors, co-workers, and community members, now tasked with protecting federal institutions during a constitutional crisis. Their presence serves as a visible reminder that the normal functioning of democratic government cannot be taken for granted, and that determined efforts to disrupt constitutional processes through violence or intimidation require extraordinary protective measures to ensure that the rule of law prevails over the rule of force. The National Guard has been activated with substantial forces deployed to establish expanded security perimeters around federal facilities in downtown Washington. The deployment responds to intelligence assessments regarding potential threats emerging from online extremist activity, threats against judicial and congressional officials, and the presence of individuals with violent histories in proximity to federal buildings. The security measures will remain in place for at least 30 days, encompassing critical upcoming events, including criminal arraignments, court rulings on privileged disputes, and congressional proceedings. The deployment represents the largest military presence in the Capitol since the aftermath of January 6th and reflects federal authorities' determination that preventive security measures are necessary to protect ongoing constitutional processes from disruption or violence. The presence of military forces in the nation's capital during a period of domestic political crisis represents a sobering illustration of how seriously federal officials assess the current threat environment and how fragile the normal functioning of democratic institutions has become during this period of constitutional confrontation.